Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this presentation from laggard to open source powerhouse. So this is really talking about transformative journeys to successfully build a strong open source culture. And I'm going to take two organizations to talk about this, Microsoft and Facebook. First, a bit of context. So a lot of people talk about the open source journey. One of the examples that I really like is Nithya Ruff's example, which essentially sees the open source journey as a series of steps coming from ignoring open source and then consuming it, to complying to open source licenses, to contributing back, and then to creating a community. I've slightly amended it to talk about culture as a last step, right? So ignore, consume, comply, contribute, culture. Because I think essentially at the heart, what's really important, what's really valuable about open source is culture, and here is why. I'm sure you're all familiar with the technology adoption lifecycle. This is essentially a way of dividing community, a pool of adopters, into 5 sections. First, the innovators are the first ones to really start using your products. Then you have the early adopters, the early majority, the late majority, and the laggards. A lot of companies today are still laggards in the open source space, and really this conversation is about how you move from being a laggard to being an innovator in that space. It's interesting to sort of map the technology adoption cycle to the 5 different steps of the open source journey that we talked about earlier. And so if we look at consuming, which is the second step after essentially ignoring open source, we realize that even in specific verticals that, like financial services, everyone consumes open source, right? It's literally 100%. And this dates from a 29 report, but this is increasingly, increasingly, if you can, be more than 100%. Essentially, open source is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. So if we move up those stairs and look at compliance, the way I look at compliance is sort of a bit sideways to look at, well, you have to comply if you're using open source and products. And so let's look at that because we have data around this, right? And so this is an open source, it's the Open Source Programs in the Enterprise 2019 survey, which essentially shows that, again, for financial services, but this is sort of like broadly true across the spectrum of verticals, open source is used in about 3/4 of shipped software, and really regularly for 58%, right? So we're really sort of like in the early majority, late majority space at this point. Contributing falls down. If you look at financial services, we're really talking about between 10 and 20%. It's higher in tech, where we're close to not even close. We're over half of companies contributing back on a regular basis. And we unfortunately don't have a lot of data about companies adopting open source culture, though a lot of the most advanced practices around DevOps, inner source, etc., are actually building on this. So why would you want to build a strong open source culture? Well, essentially because this is where the value is, right? Everyone is doing the rest already. At least everyone is using open source. 3/4 of consumers of open source are actually shipping their products and complying to license requirements as a result. Increasingly, people are contributing back. Companies are contributing back. We're talking about 50% of tech companies, maybe 1/4 to 1/3 of companies in other verticals. And so really, if you want to be innovating, building a strong open source culture is where the value is. And unsurprisingly, tech companies, and in particular large tech companies, have really understood this and are leveraging it. So the question then is, well, actually, how do you build a strong open source culture? How do you move from being a laggard in the space to being an innovator, to being an open source powerhouse? For this, we'll look at two corporations that really did an incredible U-turn over the course of the last decade, and the first one is Facebook. So, when I joined Facebook in 2010, it was perceived by the community as an open source graveyard. This is where open source projects went to die, as Facebook hired open source maintainers to come work on its proprietary products. Which isn't to say that Facebook hadn't focused on open source in the past, notably by releasing Cassandra in 2008, right? So in 2012, a friend of mine who was a long-time open source contributor started asking internally, are Facebook engineers still contributing to open source? And isn't this a problem if they're not, right? And this led to building, to really refocusing the organization on open source, led to them launch the announcement of React, start of building React in 2013, and then the announcement and React getting traction in 2014, and later on a keynote at OSCON in 2015, where James Pierce, my manager when I was at Facebook, really started talking about the benefits of open source for the company and how they had leveraged open source for a number of different business benefits. So here, if you sort of like see the visibility of open source, sort of dipping until really this React launch, and then sort of climbed from there. And the value to the company sort of followed with a bit of a delay because React had really a rough start, right? But ended up really transforming the public perception of the company. As Lee Byron, who is a software engineer, ex-Facebook software engineer, said in a podcast, React was having this outsized impact on Facebook's ability to attract and retain great talent and to establish itself as a well-known brand in software engineering. And what's interesting is that informed their further practice of open source, which is they saw the success that they were having was React. And so they started looking for other projects and made sure to find overlap between internal benefits, so business benefits for the organization, and community priorities. So let's now have a look at Microsoft. So Microsoft has a really rough start with open source, right? All the way back to Linux is a cancer, the famous quote from Steve Ballmer, right? And it took a lot of time for Microsoft to move beyond that initial phase. In 2012, they added Linux to the Azure cloud solution. And that really started accelerating when Satya Nadella became CEO. Satya really talked a lot about de-siloing the company and really leveraged the concepts of open source to help with this. So he famously said, I tell my colleagues they could get to own a customer scenario, not the code. So really, Microsoft embraced inner source. And this was really noticeable from 2015 onwards. I started seeing a lot of friends from the open source community and the web community joining Microsoft, which, like a decade earlier would have been impossible, right? Because Microsoft had such a bad rep among open source practitioners. And in 2016, Microsoft joined the Linux Foundation, then it acquired GitHub, joined YN, et cetera, right? And now, like, everyone sees Microsoft as this huge open source powerhouse. And so in terms of visibility, you really see this increase in visibility that is aligned with an increased value to the company, where today it's essentially one of the strongest proponents of open source out there among the large tech companies. So to quickly recap, if you want to build a strong open source culture, you need grassroots support. This is what happened at Facebook. You need one or multiple change agents. At Facebook, part of it was this friend of mine driving this effort and really carrying this conversation internally. And you need to have management support and executive buy-in. This can come upfront, or this can be built in. So at Microsoft, really, this was a top-down effort. And at Facebook, this was sort of like the buy-in came as executives saw the benefits firsthand of really building that culture. And of course, you need lots of time. In both of these cases, this took multiple years, close to a decade when you look at Microsoft, right? And so an OSPO can be there, so an open source programs office can be there in support of this work like it was at Facebook, or can be the change agent as it was at Microsoft under the direction of the executive, right? And as I mentioned, change can be top down or bottom up. In either case, what's really, really important is to consider making the effort sustainable, because if you don't, then what happens is it's a fad, and a number of years down the road, as soon as other goals, other focus shows up, people start forgetting about it. So you really want alignment with company goals. At Microsoft, it was really about breaking internal silos. And at Facebook, it was really about the company's image and driving recruiting. So you really have to find these key goals of what your strategy wants to focus on and drive. Lastly, I really want to underline that we talk a lot about the open source journey, but in fact, really, it's a practice. And I want to close with Satya Nadella's words that I think are really meaningful here. About his effort of changing Microsoft, and he says the following: "Because I've made culture change at Microsoft such a high priority, people often ask how it's going. Well, I suppose my response is very Eastern. We're making great progress, but we should never be done. It's not a program with a start and an end. It's a way of being." And I think that's the key takeaway really from this Express presentation, is that building culture is changing who you are as an organization, and embracing open source is really something that you transform into and then become. And that informs a lot of the way you build software and a lot of the way you react as an organization. And that's it. Thank you very much for your attention. And I'm glad to discuss this in the chat some more. Thank you so much.